Hey guys, today we are going to talk about media and politics. So basically, where the government intersects the media and what the media's role is in that effect. All right, so here we go. All right, so the first thing to know when you're talking about media and the government, it usually revolves around the presidency. We'll talk more about this when we get into the presidential unit, but he has something called the bully pulpit, where basically people are more likely to listen to the president than any other political figure. One, because of his status, and two, because of the large amount of news interest that it generates. So when the president speaks, people tend to listen more often. Therefore, the press is more likely to cover it because it adds more to their ad revenue by getting more clicks, views, etc. Therefore, the president is oftentimes asked questions by the press. There is a dedicated press corps that has access to the White House. They have their own designated room in the White House, like an office, basically space for the press corps to operate in, because so much news comes out of the White House. Usually, most major news sources, especially broadcast news sources, have a dedicated news journalist that works at the White House, and that's their full-time job. That's why they have the office there set up for all the different news reporters. That way they can, report on, the breaking news that happens that oftentimes, like I said, comes out of the White House. Usually the president doesn't speak to the media directly. He does, obviously, from time to time. Most of the time, though, he uses his White House press secretary, and he has a full White House staff dealing with the press. But his press secretary that you can see down here in the bottom right-hand corner, which does change from time to time, especially during the Trump presidency. He had at least 5 or 6 different ones during the 4 years, and it's hard to keep track, to be honest. But this is the current one. I think Kylie McEnany or something like that is her name. But her job is to deal with the press, right, and be the mouthpiece of the president. Her job is to make the president look good, and to oftentimes spin the story in a certain way that kind of portrays the president and his actions in a positive light. Because as we see with, starting with Nixon and the role of, the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, we start seeing that the press has become increasingly adversarial with the role of the president and with government in general, but specifically with the president. And the reason why is an increase in that investigative journalism, where we have see more of that watchdog function, and keeping the presidency and government in line by exposing any type of scandal can lead to positive ratings and reviews, but also serves a vital need in the democracy to ensure transparency and things like that. So one of the press secretary's main roles is to handle the press, which oftentimes is trying to, get a quick soundbite or trip you up by their questioning to get something that makes the president or the staff look bad. Because that generates more views. So it's kind of a tough job, but that's one of the things that is their role as the press secretary and the rest of the press staff at the White House. Oftentimes, too, as well, that we see them, try to paint a more positive picture than what the media is portraying. So, like if there's a negative story about the president, oftentimes the press secretary or the president himself will present an alternative viewpoint, such as what we call spinning the story, or trying to turn it around into a positive thing, or at least stop the negative view. Additionally, the White House oftentimes has to deal with leaks within the staff, and so oftentimes they try to pinpoint where that information would have came from, because the press, as you might imagine, tries to get secret information from different people that have more knowledge on the situation from within government, and therefore they try to get information maybe off the record or anonymously. So it's oftentimes beneficial to the president and the staff to figure out where that leak is coming from and try to close that leak, so to speak. Okay. But in general, we see that the president since Nixon, has had an increasingly difficult role with the press in general. That they tend to butt heads from time to time, and you can see that very clearly in Trump's presidency and in his role with the press as well. Okay, all right. So dealing with Congress, how does Congress deal with the media? Congress has much less access, right? They don't have that bully pulpit, right? There's so many people in Congress, if you're talking about the Senate and the House combined. So especially in the House, it's very difficult to get any kind of like airtime with the media. But even in the Senate, it's difficult as well. One thing that they oftentimes utilize is C-SPAN. C-SPAN, remember, is that full-time government, like live action, so to speak, news channel that focuses on what's going on in Congress right now. So they can use certain, like speeches that they give or demonstrations that they do to get sound bites, which may go viral and be picked up by, possible like news stations and things like that. And so for that reason, C-SPAN works to their advantage. A good example is this guy right here. I can't remember how to pronounce his last name, but basically he's a senator from Oklahoma. And to demonstrate that climate change was a hoax, about 4 or 5 years ago, he brought a snowball into the Senate floor and tossed it as he was giving a speech to prove to the rest of Congress, I suppose, and to others, that climate change was a hoax and that global warming was not real. so anyway, that was his use of C-SPAN in that instance. Additionally, they hold press conferences from time to time, like when major bills come out or major news comes out of Congress. But typically that is usually the role of the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader like Mitch McConnell, or like I said, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Those types of officials are the ones that usually provide those interviews, and so they control also typically who gets to access for those interviews. And so you usually have to work your way up to getting some of those high level interviews. Additionally, both the president and Congress deal with the media by, deciding what is released to the media. Remember, we talked about the Freedom of Information Act allows the press to request documents from the government. But remember, there's so many exceptions, and that's because the potential for secret information that may not necessarily be beneficial to government being released. And so what they tend to do instead is classify documents. Therefore, they cannot be released under the Freedom of Information Act. So this limits the press's access to that information. Additionally, they actually use leaks. Both the president and Congress use leaks to their advantage. One thing they do is something called a trial balloon, where something quote unquote leaks to the press, although it was really done on purpose, but anonymously to gauge public reaction. So for instance, if President Trump was thinking about nominating a controversial pick, to the Supreme Court, he might release the name before he actually formally announces it through someone in his staff. Like I said, quote unquote leak. It was done on purpose just to gauge public reaction. If the reaction is relatively popular and it goes well, then he say, yeah, that was the thing. Sorry, it got out, but yes, that was me all along. But if it was a negative view on this perceived leak, Trump could come back and say, well, no, that was just hearsay. I wasn't actually going to pick them, and so he can kind of gauge public reaction with these quote unquote trial balloons. Now, this happens both by the president and through Congress from time to time. And then finally, shield laws. Shield laws are put in place for people to talk anonymously with the press. You have the ability to talk anonymously with the press at the state level. In most states, they have shield laws. But at the federal level and in many states as well, they don't have shield laws that protect you in case you are an anonymous source and the person who reports on a possible wrongdoing or something like that has to testify in court. They have to, if there's no shield law in place, give up their source, and therefore the source is not protected under this particular situation. In South Carolina, we do have certain shield laws. Now, there are limits to it, but at the federal level, there are no shield laws. And if someone were to release sensitive information, they could be held accountable for their actions, regardless if they were on the record or they were wanting to be anonymous. That would be up to the reporter to decide whether or not they wanted to go to jail over not releasing their source or not. All right, so we're going to end talking about the media with current trends. So trends in modern media. The number one trend that you need to be aware of is the movement from broadcast to narrowcast. Now, of course, we still have broadcast, which tries to appeal to a wide range of Americans. And broadcast, typically, like your major like NBC News or Associated Press, right? Those types of things are going to be more middle of the road in terms of ideology, less politically controversial. They're going to be more fact reporting, all those kind of things. The broadcast media is because they're trying to appeal to a wide range of people. But on the opposite hand, we have an increased use in availability of narrowcasting, which is only appealing to a certain segment of the population, right? A narrow group of the population. This includes major news networks now today, such as Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. These all arose to provide more analysis and commentary for the average person, and also to provide a little more like intrigue and possible like personalities to the equation, rather than simply reporting on the news like the major broadcast companies do. This has led to a decrease in trust in television in terms of, the amount of trust Americans have because of the increased amount of, bias that is involved. But effectively, what it does is it allows people who particularly, are more conservative or liberal to choose news sources that match their ideological views. So typically conservatives gravitate towards Fox News as their go-to news source. And what this does is actually increases partisanship. It makes people more conservative the more they watch Fox News if they're already conservative. And on the flip side, if you are liberal and you watch MSNBC, which is a liberal slant, it tends to reinforce your already held views, because it's like someone constantly agreeing with you and providing information and evidence to back up your already held belief. So we call this an echo chamber, where you're not hearing about opposing viewpoints, or it's kind of like propaganda. It's not quite to that extent, but it creates a false narrative that there's only one side of the story, right? And that reinforces people's minds and actually pushes them further away from the middle, and even more radical towards like liberal or conservative sides. All right. We sometimes call this confirmation bias, right? So you already held a belief. Fox News, agrees and has a similar type of belief and provides evidence as to why they believe that, and that confirms your already held bias, right? And so that reinforces that viewpoint. Additionally, the ownership of sources has decreased over time, so there's limited amounts of variety in major news sources, both TV, radio, print, etc., are all held by like relatively few companies. And so like they bought up, the large companies bought up all the smaller companies. And so this creates a limited number of news sources you can get. And that means that the ones that are available tend to have a more either liberal or conservative bias. And we know that typically we see more of those news sources, siding on the liberal side of the spectrum. All right. So this has increased the amount of partisanship and decreased the amount of variety of news that, comes out, right? That media is the gatekeeper role. All right. Speaking of media as the gatekeeper, all right. Not only does the media create a gatekeeper effect, but also the public in today's time becomes more of a gatekeeper and watchdog. This has become increasingly true thanks to certain things such as social media becoming much more, popular as a news source. People share their views that way. They, you see individual people getting involved in trying to hold government accountable, speaking up more through social media. Additionally, things like WikiLeaks, where government entities or people within the government can leak classified information that wouldn't necessarily get out, that might be damaging to the government reputation, such as like if anybody remembers Edward Snowden came out, like I guess it's been several years now, but he released like public information sharing that essentially the NSA came out saying that they did not surveil a lot of Americans, and he worked with the NSA and like released all these documents showing that they did have all this like secret surveillance that wasn't supposed to be going on to WikiLeaks. And now he's like a outcast in Russia and cannot make it back to the U.S. But the more the internet and these types of sources are around, the more the public has the ability to hold government accountable and serve as that watchdog. More news can come out of social media, and so the traditional media is no longer the only gatekeeper. Social media has increased the amount of news that's out there. Right. The flip side of that is that you have the ability for more fake news, right? So, stories get released on social media. They're not as credible as like major broadcast and traditional mainstream media. And therefore, you have the ability for not being able to decipher whether or not this is actually true or not. All right. So it has the double-edged sword. And then finally, we have an increase in infotainment over time. So this is like SNL that does their political comedy sketches where they lampoon the president and other officials. You see like the Daily Show, the Colbert Report, these late night shows. What this does is actually does increase internal efficacy. It does add, people who, it informs them more on what's going on in government, or raises more awareness in that sense, but it also creates more cynicism. It makes people think that that politics may be a joke and that everybody is not necessarily acting in the public's best interest, because that's what they like to show. It's only good for infotainment when it's funny or scandalous and things like that. That's what they make jokes about. And so if that's constantly the only source of news that you're taking in, you may get the impression that all of government is bad, scandalous, funny, right? Kind of a joke. So it creates this sense of cynicism. And additionally, it does allow some people to feel like more connected, because you can more easily connect with some of those jokes and simplified terms that they put things in on these infotainment sources, rather than the general like high level news where it's very plain. It's maybe not as entertaining, and so you increase the number of people that tune into politics. And increase internal efficacy and awareness. However, it does create a level of cynicism. All right. So that is the main things that we need to know. Make sure that you go back and review over, all the different parts of the media, the New York Times case, and things like that. But that is it for us today, guys.